Travel around Athens today, and you see that the modern city looms much larger than the traces of its past. And yet, just as we get the odd glimpse of old buildings, so too it's sometimes possible to catch a hint of the ideas the ancient Greeks have given us. Almost 2,500 years ago, a philosopher was born here. His name was Sócrates, and he's come to symbolize one of philosophy's most inspiring gifts to the rest of us. The idea that thinking logically about our lives might help us to be more certain of ourselves, more independent, less conformist, less hamstrung by what other people think. It's the dream that philosophy might set us free. I'd come to Athens to see how a man who famously died for his beliefs might give us the confidence to stand up for our own. Sócrates wrote nothing down, and we know what he said chiefly through a series of dialogues he features in, written by his pupil Plato. In deciding when to follow prominent people and when to disagree with them, Sócrates had one huge advantage over us. He could always talk to them in person. Athens in his day had a population of just 150,000, and all the citizens came here to the Agora, the main market and meeting place of Athens. If you'd have visited in the 5th century BC, you'd have been likely to see, amongst the bustle of the city, a rather curious, ugly figure. Because for most of his adult life, Sócrates got up at dawn and came to spend the day amongst the shopkeepers and merchants who had their stalls here. It wasn't just local people who came to this spot. It was also the most important people in Athenian society, so that you could meet here at any point in the day, probably, as it were, the opinion formers, the great military generals, the great statesmen, the important rhetoricians, the aristocrats. They could all be found here. And what Sócrates did, rather than just idly chatting to people, he would go up to these very important people and ask them great questions on life. He'd basically ask them to explain why they were living the kind of life they were leading. And what happened is that he found there were surprising inadequacies in their understanding of the way of life they were leading, so that wealthy people couldn't really explain why they had money and others didn't. Military generals couldn't explain why they fought battles in a certain way. And I think we take away from this a fascinating lesson, which is that if you have the luck, or at least the courage, to go up to important people and question the way that they're leading their lives, you might be able to find surprising inadequacies of which their very confident demeanor gave absolutely no indication. The second reason we may hesitate to challenge other people is that we all know in our calmer moments how easy it is to make trouble for the wrong reasons, because we're feeling pig-headed or bloody-minded. Sócrates was a nonconformist, and he made trouble for Athenians. But he wasn't motivated by an arrogant wish that everyone should do things his way, nor by the kind of willful eccentricity we might think of when we hear that he went around barefoot and never washed his cloak. What makes his nonconformity valuable is that it was motivated by the desire to find the truth and challenge lazy assumptions, rather than the wish to make trouble. The reason why there are a lot of woolly, or at least imprecise, ideas out there in the world is that many people imagine that you can come up with a good idea without thinking too hard about it. Sócrates thought this was crazy, and to bring out the insanity of this position, compared thinking to potting. And no one would imagine that you could make a good pot without at least following some pretty rigorous steps. And yet many people imagine that you could come up with a good ethical idea, an idea on how to live your life, without thinking too hard about it. Sócrates went further in his analogy. He actually came up with a distinct method, a Socratic method of thought. He identified 5 distinct steps which anyone who wants to come up with a good thought would have to follow in order to do so. And these thoughts can roughly be summarized as follows. Firstly, look around you for statements that many people would describe as plain common sense. For example, that the best jobs are those which are most highly paid, or that happiness comes from being married. Secondly, try and find an exception to this. Could you ever be married and yet unhappy? Or could you ever be in a very well-paid job and yet miserable? Thirdly, if an exception to this statement is found, it must mean that your statement is false or at least imprecise. And in this case, we find that there is an imprecision. fourthly, try to nuance the initial statement to take the exception into account. So in our example, realize that it is possible to be quite unhappy in a very highly paid job if it's completely creatively unfulfilling, or to be quite miserable in a marriage if you've married the wrong person. Lastly, you continue this process for as long as possible. You keep trying to find exceptions to your common sense statement. And Socrates said that the truth, insofar as anyone's ever able to reach the truth, lies in a statement which it seems impossible to disprove.
If we test our opinions in this way, Socrates believed, we'll be able to construct trustworthy and watertight thoughts, in just the same way as a skilled potter makes trustworthy and watertight pots. The point of Socrates' method is that it makes you far less passive, less inclined to follow the other sheep. If other people disagree, we don't just have to say, limply or petulantly, well, I think I'm right, but I can't tell you why. We'll be able to demonstrate logically why we believe things, and if others ignore the logic, then their opposition won't have to unnerve us so badly.
Most of us imagine that we can't be philosophers because we haven't studied philosophy, we haven't read enough, we haven't gone to school long enough, we haven't done a university degree. And I think what I find extremely inspiring in Socrates is the idea that everyone can think. And not just everyone can think, but everyone has a responsibility to think. As he famously put it, the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates made the idea of an examined life seem far from forbidding.
Socrates suggests that we can have an interesting philosophical conversation anywhere, even on a street corner. Philosophy needn't just happen behind the walls of a university or in a schoolroom. Socrates used to talk to an extraordinary range of people and liked to demonstrate to them that they were all able to arrive at well-thought-out opinions. It's an inspiring idea. However, in our modern democratic societies, where focus groups and opinion pollsters rule, Socrates would have thought that our problem is that we tend to listen to opinions whether they're well thought out or not. The one fact that people tend to remember about Socrates is that he faced a trial and that he was condemned to death. This has remained a very potent image, so that if you walk around the streets of Athens today, you can still see the scene represented all over the place. And that's because it has become an immensely powerful symbol of someone standing up courageously and intelligently against the will of the majority. The charge against Socrates was of having corrupted the youth of Athens and failing to respect the gods the city worshipped. The potential penalty was death.
One March morning, Socrates was asked to show up at the courthouse in Athens, and Socrates was facing probably a jury of 500 Athenian citizens. And what we do know is that the atmosphere inside the courtroom was relatively hostile towards Socrates from the very beginning. They were suspicious of this man. Many of them had been questioned by him before, and they were not on his side. So Socrates was really facing the possibility that he would die, and yet he didn't lose his nerve. And Socrates said, if I was allowed more time to make my case to you, dear Athenians, I'm sure I could convince you of the justice of my cause, but I can't. And he accepted this very fatalistically. When the final vote came to be taken, the majority of the jury decided that he was guilty and that he should be sent to death.
Socrates was led off from the courtroom to the prison just a few yards away. His wife, Xanthippe, came to visit him, but she broke down so hysterically that she had to be led away. Many of his friends were also in tears. Even the prison warder, who had seen many go to their deaths, offered his apologies and said that of all the people who had ever come through the jail, Socrates was the noblest, the most generous, and the wisest. And a few moments later, the executioner came through the door with a cup of hemlock. Socrates was given the cup and asked to drink.
And after a few moments, his legs began to feel heavy. Slowly, the paralysis caused by the conine, the paralyzing agent in hemlock, started working through his body. And within a few minutes, his whole body was paralyzed. And his friend Fido reached forward and shut his eyes. In Athens today, there's very little of the glory that was ancient Greece and that has inspired the world ever since. And yet, the ideas of Socrates live on. He was once asked where he came from, and he replied, not from Athens, but from the world. And he remains in many ways the global philosopher, born in Athens, but speaking his message to the whole of humanity. Of course, very few of us will be called upon to die for our beliefs. But Socrates makes us see that we all have the capacity, and indeed the duty, to stop following opinions passively, and instead to develop beliefs we can truly have confidence in. Though we're often reluctant to see it, all of us can make the transition from being a sheep to being a thinking person, that is, a philosopher.